have stood really at the physical and the spiritual heart of this historic German community for much of our history. We were a very large church, counting some 2,000 members at our peak back in the sort of probably 1860s, I would say, maybe was the peak of our membership. Worship and business were conducted at this church fully in German up until the 1940s, when finally they switched to English. Like many urban churches, particularly urban ethnic congregations, ours was one that truly struggled to have a sense of who they were in a changing world and in a changing neighborhood. So that by the 1970s, the congregation had dwindled to maybe about a dozen people on Sunday mornings, not many people. And they were unable to care for this historic building, which originally had been built as the Dry Dock Methodist Church, when this was originally English and Irish Scots in this neighborhood, but was bought by us very quickly as this neighborhood became sort of overwhelmed by the German immigrants that were moving into the community. So by the 1970s, massive cracks had been discovered in the building, and it was condemned and quickly torn down. And so for about 20 years or so, we had essentially an empty lot here on the corner, and just the former rectory, which still stands through this door. You go back about 150 years when you go through those doors into what's now my office. So there are still some remnants that you can look at of our history. This, of course, is a new room, but our baptismal font right over here, right next to Richard there, dates back to the original church. It's still inscribed in German, "Lasset die Kindlein zu mir kommen," let the little children come to me. As you go down the stairs, you'll see the old stone from above the door, which is inscribed in German of our full old name. It says Erbauet 1850, built in 1850. So we're proud to have some remnants of this history, even though who we are now as a congregation is very much contemporary, very much alive, and has changed considerably from those early German days. But I'm a history nerd myself. My bachelor's degree is in history, my master's is in theology, but I'm really glad to be in a room of fellow history nerds tonight as we explore this history of German churches in Kleindeutschland. And so I think Richard.
Where did you meet during those 20 years? Did you use another facility?
Yes, so the church rented space in on 6th Street. It was originally built as like a Children's Aid Society building, and which now I believe is a veterans housing. Others of you probably know more, but yes, rented space. But at the very beginning, when the church was first demolished, all worship happened in what had been the pastor's bedrooms, which is right through that door marked pastor. That's my office now. It was that small of a church. They could gather in a bedroom, basically. Much as the earliest Christians did, if you know anything about early church history, you know that the first Christians worshiped in houses, in homes, which is what we did as well. And this building, when it was built in the 90s, was intentionally built to look almost like a house. So it doesn't look like a church. From the outside, it looks almost like an old Dutch colonial house in a way. Carolyn.
Just an aside, that building was listed as one of the finest examples of Greek revival architecture in New York City.
Look at that, Caroline. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yes, it was.
Yes, we missed this terribly, but yeah, the neighborhood looked a lot different when this building was standing on this corner. So, welcome again, everyone, here to Trinity. If you need restrooms, they're on the first floor. There's a 12-step meeting that starts at 7 o'clock, so if you do feel like you have to go, I would encourage you maybe to sneak up now and go downstairs, but you're welcome to go down there and use the restrooms after the meeting begins. Welcome, everyone, to Trinity.
Well, thank you, Pastor Will, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. It looks a little scary out there, but decently warm, right? And I'm Richard Moses from the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative, also known as LESPI. We're a not-for-profit, all-volunteer preservation organization started in 2007 to preserve the history and architecture and culture of the traditional Lower East Side, which includes the East Village, Lower East Side below Houston Street, Chinatown, Little Italy, and the Bowery. We do this primarily through New York City landmarking, but we also advocate for smart growth, instead of overdevelopment, for trying to maintain the viability of our mom and pop stores, and for other methods of trying to keep the special character of our Lower East Side. So this is going to be a great event tonight, and I just hope also that not only you'll enjoy Richard's presentation, but you'll stick around at the end for wine and cheese and chatting. So now I want to say a word about our event co-sponsors, who I really want to thank for their participation tonight. For Village Preservation, where we have the crew in the back. Founded in 1980, Village Preservation works to document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. Village Preservation has successfully advocated for the landmark designation of more than 1,300 buildings and hosts over 75 free public programs throughout the year. Consider becoming a member today. The East Village Community Coalition fosters the unique vibe of the East Village through our retail diversity, sustainability, and cultural preservation initiatives. Please check out the EVCC's new blog, In and Around the Park, on their website at evccnyc.org/stories, and share your thoughts by taking their 2025 community survey. Do you have that, Laura? Laura here? Well, at the end, you'll be able to probably take get a link to the survey. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Richard Haberstroh. He's been a great friend of Leslie over the years. Richard is a native New Yorker whose German ancestors arrived in the city between 1835 and 1852 and resided primarily in the Lower East Side's Kleindeutschland. An accredited genealogist who has been involved in German genealogical research since 1984, Richard has published numerous genealogical articles and is the author of The German Churches of Metropolitan New York, a research guide. So please let's give Richard a hearty welcome.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to everybody for coming out tonight. Luckily, the rain is more or less holding off, so that's a good thing. But as Richard said, I'm going to be talking about that topic there. It's a little bit different than most of the topics I've spoken on. It had to do with Kleindeutschland, a little more focused towards the churches. So there's a lot of new material, hopefully for you, but also for me. So if I have to pause once in a while and gather my thoughts, I hope you'll forgive me. I have my fearless assistant doing the cooking for me here today. Okay, well, just to put everything into context, I thought it would be good to talk a tiny bit about immigration of the Germans into the United States, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. It was the 19th century in particular where the biggest burst of immigration from Germany and also from Ireland occurred, and so many immigrants came into this country. Here is a little chart that shows the number of German immigrants into the United States by decade. It's a little hard to read the numbers, but that's 1820. This peak here is not 1820, but the 1820s. This peak is the 1840s. And this peak that not many people talk about is the 1880s, but that sweet spot from about 1830 to 1890 was really when the greatest majority of Germans came into this country. And some people say that one of the causes for the initial immigration out of Europe, in particular France and Western Germany, was an event that happened in 1815 when I think a volcano named Tambora or something like that. Naturally, it was in the East Indies somewhere. It blew up, and all the ash and dust and whatever went into the atmosphere. So they called the summer following that event the year with no summer. And so right after that, I mean, people were literally starving. This section of the darkest colors is where there was the largest drop in below normal temperature. So you can see mostly in France and Western Germany. So people were literally starving to death in that area of Europe in 1816 and 1817. People sometimes say that was the start of the immigration of Germans into the United States. And it was certainly a trickle at first, not a whole lot of people coming, but by the 1830s it was really increasing dramatically every year. And by the 1870s, more Germans had come to America than in any other ethnic group. And of course, mostly by New York City, since we had such a lovely harbor here and still do. You can click again. Whoops. There we go. This is just a picture from, might have been Harper's Weekly, or one of those magazines or periodicals from the 1800s, which is supposed to be showing the Teutonic regions in New York. So it's supposed to be a scene of common German immigrants on a very hot summer's night, which luckily we don't have tonight. So all these Germans are coming through New York. A certain percentage of them stayed. And so people have done some estimates. This data came from a book called Little Germany. Is that the right time? Anyway, it's Stanley Nagel's, but that's okay. Stanley Nagel's book about Kleindeutschland. So he has estimated, based on the population and from censuses and that sort of thing, what the percentage of the population was German born in 1815, 16%, 60, 25%. You can see by 1880, it's up to 31% of the population of New York City was German born. A lot of people don't realize the size of the German influence in New York City, really. And back in the 1830s, the early 1830s, around the time when Kleindeutschland was beginning to become a thing, an ethnic enclave in New York City, this is what the map of New York City looked like. And the dark areas are the more developed areas where all the blocks pretty much are filled with buildings, usually tenements or other kinds of commercial or industrial buildings. But you can see, here's Tompkins Square Park. You can see that these are undeveloped areas here on the east side, and also in the northern parts of other areas in the city. But so I always say, we call this the Lower East Side, but when the Germans first started coming in here, it was kind of like the Upper East Side. So not that it had that kind of cachet, but. This is just pointing out that because of the influx of all the immigrants, and not just German, but German and Irish mostly, they had to create a new ward, the 17th ward in 1837, and then the 18th ward in 1846, because the population was just increasing so quickly. And by the way, the Germans liked to call Tompkins Square Park der Weiße Garten, the White Garden. Being an obsessed genealogist, one time I went through city directories and pulled out the name of everyone who was Schmidt or anything like Schmidt, so that I knew that it was a German name, so basically any SCH name except for Schuyler and a few things like that. And I plotted them on these maps. It just shows you kind of how the German area increased with time. 1845 are the red dots here, the green dots are 1850. It just happens that they seem to be very much clustered near some of the bigger churches in the area. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. By 1870, you can see there's a lot more red dots, especially in this area just below Tompkins Square, above Tompkins Square. I put this oval here That's sort of what I consider my estimate of what we call Kleindeutschland at that time. I don't know if the reason the dots are a little more scattered in like this area down below Houston is because the tenements didn't hold as many people. They were older tenements. I think that's probably one of the causes. But anyway, so this is how the neighborhood grew over the decades. Okay. Okay. So, I'm going to start talking about the Catholic Church and the development of those churches in a way because I have had the most information available, but also because the beginnings of the church of the Catholic Church are more recent than the Protestant churches among the Germans and just in general. Because the Catholic Church was actually banned from New York Colony by the English, so there were laws that would penalize priests for even being here and things like that. So there really were no Catholic churches. It may have been a handful of Catholics who practiced their religion secretly or something like that. But there was no Catholic church in New York City until 1785 when St. Peter's downtown was formed. And the funny thing is, I don't know if it's just coincidence, but it was a German Jesuit priest who founded the congregation. I mean, it was never thought of as a German church, but it just happened to be founded by a German. I don't think he was the pastor for long, but yeah, it was just an odd little fact. Now, in 1808, which happened to be the year that New York Diocese was formed from the Baltimore Diocese, which was almost all of the United States at the time. But in 1808, New York became its own diocese, and at that time there was a petition sent to Bishop Carroll, who was the bishop in Baltimore, saying that we really like a German language church here in New York City to properly practice our religion, and that was always one of the ways that the German clerics and even the lay people would express the importance of it. They felt there was a tie between practicing your religion and the language in which you learn that religion, whether it be the terms of the customs or whatever, but it was felt to them very important to have their own churches. So when the diocese was established, it just happened to be that same year that someone named Anton Coleman, or Anthony Coleman, as they would say, came from Alsace, and being from Alsace, which was totally a German-speaking area, but it was also part of France, so he could speak French and he could speak German, and when he came to this country, he learned to speak English. So, as the pastor of St. Peter's Church, he did hold services in English, French, and German. So that was helpful to the German population, but they were still anxious to have their own church. In 1826, Pope Leo the 12th appointed Jean de Bois, Bishop of New York, which was, up to that point, the bishops, mostly, if not completely, had been Irish, so this was something a little different. And he was apparently recommended to the Pope by Anton Coleman, who had, after his stay at St. Peter's, had gone to Rome to work in various positions in Rome. So he suggested Jean de Bois, who was born in Paris, and Jean de Bois was the Bishop of New York at the time, in 1833. And a priest came from Austria, from the southern Tyrol, from a little town in the mountains, basically, and When he came to New York, Bishop Dubois was very sympathetic to the Germans not having church services in German, so he had come to be a missionary to the Germans in the United States, but he was on his way to Cincinnati. He got collared in New York and convinced to stay here. And so he did open the first German-speaking congregation here in 1833, and later he was made the Vicar General in New York. So I kind of said this already, but just to put this into context with where the Germans fit into the Catholic Church in this city, I took a quote. So I just pulled this quote out of a book, but a very good book called The Immigrant Church by J.P. Dolan. And he was trying to put the whole German-Irish thing in context within the Catholic Church. So this is a quote from the book. I'll read most of it. Bishop Hughes dedicated new churches and confirmed German children, but as an Irishman, he never bridged the gap separating him from German Catholics. The apparent lack of concern in not appointing a successor to the Vicar General Refiner, that guy I was just talking about, came from Austria after he retired. Oh, oops. Oh. Anyway, the Germans were kind of ignored by the Irish bishops, and as much as they didn't like that, they were still happy that they weren't interfering in their affairs. So, okay. This is the Johann Stephan Refiner, or John Stephen Refiner, missionary to the German Catholics in the U.S. And he did so much to establish churches in New York and other parts of the country that he is generally considered to be the apostle of the Germans. He was born in this little town. It was so quaint looking at. Pulled out a picture of it. In Austria, in the southern Tyrol, to a wealthy family. He had started religious studies, but because of the Napoleonic Wars and the rather harsh treatment of religious institutions, and particularly the Catholic Church, by the Napoleonic government, he had to interrupt his studies, became a doctor, served in the army. Finally, in 1825, at the age of 40, he was ordained, and then he came to New York, as I said, and aside from founding St. Nicholas Church, which is the church that used to be right over on 2nd Street between First Avenue and Avenue A, there's a parking lot there now, unfortunately, but the old rectory building is still there. He had a hand in, he wasn't the pastor in all of them, but he had a hand supposedly in about establishing about 30 different churches, German Catholic churches, including one in Boston, which I'll mention probably briefly again later. But he was really a tireless major force in establishing German language Catholic churches in this time period from about 1833 to the mid to late 1840s. Okay. One more. Okay. So this is what St. Nicholas Church used to look like. Much like George Costanza, I would like to pretend I'm an architect, but I'm not. But I think this may be considered neo-Gothic. This was actually the second church built on 2nd Street. I forgot the year it was built. Maybe, I think it was 440. 36 was when the church moved to 2nd Street. And they had a much smaller church at that time. And this, I think, was about 1848 that they built. Yes, I'm sure it was. This was built in 1848. This was, of course, a carefully drawn sketch. This is a sketch of the interior. Okay. There we go. All I needed to do was see the words now, would have remembered. Okay, so yeah, the first space was in a rented building at Bidden Delancey. They pretty quickly built the first church on 2nd Street and the second church in 1848. Good, that's good. And so that all seems like a wonderful thing. Only there was a slight problem within the Catholic Church back in those days, and it had to do with something called trusteeism, which I still totally don't understand, but somehow or other, the lay people were really given control of the parishes more so than the priests. So there was often battles between the priests and the lay parishioners, to the point where priests were often just resigning because they couldn't deal with the trustees of the church. So that's what happened in St. Nicholas. So Father Refiner, after being the pastor for about 8 years, just couldn't deal with the issues anymore. So he left St. Nicholas, he moved to Williamsburg and founded Most Holy Trinity, the first German Catholic church on Long Island. And the church he founded in Boston a few years later was also called Most Holy Trinity. Anyway, I put that in there just to let you know that the reason I didn't say it was the first German Catholic church in Brooklyn was when it was founded, Williamsburg wasn't part of the city of Brooklyn, so I couldn't say that. But it became the oldest German Catholic church in Brooklyn. So 1842, there was another priest who was given the unhappy job of being the pastor at St. Nicholas. He was a Redemptorist, and the Redemptorists had become a pretty strong force in starting new German churches in this country and ministering to the German parishioners. And he was one of them, and he was appointed, and he lasted 2 years, and then he decided that they had to start a new congregation. So, this is a little bit about him, quick again. That should be. So he left St. Nicholas, and he found a lot about 2 blocks away on 3rd Street, right off Avenue A. And this is just a little bit about where he came from, et cetera, et cetera. But so they found a lot, and believe it or not, within 7 weeks, they built the first version of Most Holy Redeemer. According to the anniversary book of Most Holy Redeemer, a lot of the work was done by volunteer German tradespeople. And yeah, so 7 weeks they built what to me looks like a very odd church. It was kind of like a long, empty building, but it was a place where they could hold their services, and then they also opened a school that taught in German and English. But yeah, this came from the Most Holy Redeemer anniversary book. I like the fact that the trustees of St. Nicholas like to call it the Spite Church. And as was happening with almost all new congregations in New York City, they open up, they build a church, and before you know it, the congregation outgrows the church. So St. Nicholas had already built their second church by 1848, so then Most Holy Redeemer built their second church, which looks more like a real church. Actually, it's an incredibly, whether you like the style or not, it's incredibly majestic. It's a large church, a beautiful large steeple, very ornate on the outside, with a lot of Baroque decoration. Click again. That's good. And yeah, so I think think I put down on here something about, oh yeah, they called it Romanesque revival. That makes sense, it certainly looks Romanesque to me, the non-architect. I've also heard it described as Romanesque, Baroque, and Byzantine revival. So again, I can't speak to that, but it's a very, very interesting and a very large structure. So it's clear that by that time, Most Holy Redeemer had become maybe the favored church in the neighborhood. I'm not sure. So I took a few pictures, just so you get, if you've never been in the church, it's still, the exterior is a little simpler than it was when it was first built, but the interior is still incredibly ornate. You get a sense of the size of it and the height, the beautiful stained glass windows. Over here, there's a lot of what I would call the Baroque ornamentation in the interior. Here's the main altar. This is one of the side altars, and I forget what it's dedicated to. I think I know, but I don't want to say it because I might be wrong. But yeah, all along the sides, on both sides of the church, there were all these separate little altars and shrines and things like that. It's really interesting to do it. And this is what the exterior looks like now, which you can tell it's changed from the original. You don't see a lot of Baroque ornamentation, and actually, I think it was in the early 1900s, they refaced the building. They lowered the steeple a little too, so it used to have like another section or two about like that, raising it even higher. But when you see it, it still towers above everything else in the neighborhood. I always found these little, I don't know what you call them, semi-columns, interesting, because like each one has a different design. That's in the entranceway, and it has the little figures that were actually, they were common as gargoyles on exteriors, but in Baroque church architecture, a lot of times you do see little figures like that up on the tops of columns in the interior of the church. Again. And one more. Okay, this is just kind of a summary of a couple of nice photographs of the two churches. This one, now you can really see what that steeple was like in the original church. It's almost crazy. St. Nicholas was a little more humble. No. And again. Okay, so just to change gears slightly, I have to keep looking at my clock because I don't want to keep people here all night. But I'm going to change gears and talk a little bit about the German artisans who worked on these churches. Naturally, they were built for German communities. The architects, when you can find out who they are, they're always German architects, and they hire German workers, or volunteers, German workers. So there's a book called Immigrant Life in New York City, and the author, again, went into the statistics from 1855, actually, to figure out in different trades. I pulled out the ones that was sort of the largest percentage for Germans, but the author went through all the different trades and how many were Irish and how many were German and how many were Scottish and all that. But you can see that in some of the skilled building-related occupations, Germans made up more than half of the laborers in New York City who worked in those occupations. Cabinet makers, locksmiths, turners, it's like somebody who works the lathe, almost 50%. I happen to have a personal connection to fresco painters in New York City. Just out of curiosity, I did the same kind of an estimate, but I didn't use the same census, I used the 1870 census, and it appears that 68% of the fresco painters in New York City were German. Before my family told me that someone in my family was a fresco painter, I didn't even know there were fresco painters in the 1800s, and especially in New York City. Okay. But sure enough, 1872, the Fresco Painters Benevolent and Protective Union of the City and the County of New York was incorporated. And here's the people who are incorporating it. Everybody has a German name. And it's not even called the German Fresco Painters. And then one of them happens to be John Haberstroh, who is my great-great-grandfather. So that's why I have a connection to this. Okay. Again. And there he is. And the odd thing is, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's more of a personal thing. But this was my great-great-grandfather, a fresco painter, came here in 1850. Oddly enough, he had a first cousin from the same village in Germany who was a fresco painter in Boston, and then he had a second cousin who was also a fresco painter in Boston. And I think their business must have been better than his because they ended up, like his son was published these little booklets like advertising for their trade and just describing what they did and that kind of thing. Oh yeah, I just stuck this in here because I didn't know what fresco painters did at that time period, but they did paint some frescoes. They also did a lot of fancy plaster design on the walls. Usually they did both because it was all part of the interior decoration of the time. Yeah. One more. Yeah, this is I don't remember where I pulled this up. But anyway, this is a picture of the just the German workers of various trades, all, I think it was 1870 something, when there was a big general strike. And this was a representation of them marching through the streets. The only point here is that German laborers, skilled or otherwise, but especially the skilled laborers, were very conscious about organizing and demanding shorter work weeks and better pay and things like that. So if you look in the newspaper, and you'll see constantly references to this German union and that German union. They were having a meeting, they're going on strike, they're doing this. So they were really very, very active in general in the labor movement, which is something that we don't often think about really, at least I didn't. Again. And one more. Oh. That's okay. Yeah, these are all just blurs from the newspaper. It seems like whenever fresco painters come up, it says German fresco painters. One more quick. When they're not causing trouble and demanding this and that and the other thing, they like to do it all Germans do. They go to a park and have a picnic. So you'll see, this organization had their picnic at Jones Woods, which was some park up near
60,
yeah,
60,
right,
east side,
where the
third avenue, first avenue.
right. That was a common one, but also in the summer they'd go on excursions, go on a steamboat and go to Connecticut or Long Island or something. So they knew how to live with whatever limited free time they had. Yeah. I just want to say one other Catholic church that's very important to Kleindeutschland is Our Lady of Sorrows. It's still here, of course. It's a very different church than the ones we've seen so far, very different style. The interior is much simpler. It's just a very, very different architecture involved here. Okay. Yeah, it was established 1867, and the church was completed to 68. Again, I've been told it's Byzantine and Romanesque revival with some Victorian ornamentation. And that's about all I know. The architect, though, was Henry Engelbert, and he's one of the few architects I can find in these churches where I can find any information about it. Next. Oh, there's some pictures from the interior where you can just see got a totally different look from most buildings that came here. This is the fanciest thing in the whole church. The top of that, there's 4 columns around the middle. It has these 2 interesting things. That's what they call an oculus or something. But right over where the congregation sits, there's a dome with an opening that lets light in, and there's a similar one right over the altar. Just kind of interesting touches. So Henry Engelbert, he was born in Germany, came to New York, was part of the firm of Edson and Engelbert, and these are the buildings he's most famous for. It's a pretty good collection of places, a lot of churches, including the restoration of old St. Patrick's Cathedral, and 2 pretty impressive looking, let's call them public buildings. The German, Grand Hotel and the Atlantic Savings Bank. Atlantic Savings Bank has been a number of things over the years. The building is still there on Bond Street, right off the corner of Bond and the Bowery. It became the German Exchange Bank. I don't, does the Bowery Lane Theater still exist?
No.
No, I didn't think so. All right. I think they've made the whole building into maybe apartments and offices or something. Oh, yeah. It's beautiful looking at that. Next. Also built some buildings in other cities. He was a very busy guy. Next. And there's the building. One more place. Oh. One more. There. And this building interests me because it just happens to be coincidentally where my great-grandfather, the son of the fresco painter, worked. He worked for the German Exchange Bank, and this was where he went to work every day. Next. This just summarizes the Catholic churches. It shows their well, this isn't quite the last building, but we've talked about St. Nicholas, Masonic Redeemer, Our Lady of Sorrows, and St. Mary Magdalene. We didn't talk about, that was the latest of them, and that was all the way up on 17th Street. But by the 1870s, that was still, had become part of Kleindeutschland, at least the northern reaches of it. Yeah. Another. That's good. So, I've talked an awful lot about the Catholic churches. There are some very important Lutheran churches in particular that were born and developed important congregations here in Kleindeutschland. But in the colonial period, of course, the Protestants were welcome in New York, unlike the Catholics. So the first Lutheran church in New York was called Trinity Lutheran, opened in 1664. That was a Dutch church, but it probably served whatever German speakers there were in New York City at the time. In 1750, a German Lutheran church was opened called Christ Lutheran, or sometimes lovingly known as the Swamp Church, because I guess it was Frankfurt and William was up in the northeast relative to where everybody else was at the time, I guess in a swampy area. That church burned down. Then these two merged into United German Lutheran in 1784. Then they opened St. Matthew's. These are all basically offshoots of one another, or offshoots of Trinity, one way or another. So St. Matthew opened in 1822 as an English language church, but there were so many German immigrants coming in that it basically turned into a German language church. And it sort of moved a couple of times, like closer to where the German population was in Kleindeutschland. That's the only picture I can find of this Swamp Church. It looks like something my kid drew. Okay. So, those are the Lutherans. The other main Protestant German denomination was Reformed. So Lutheran was always the largest German, always since the Reformation. Lutheran and Reformed together were about 2/3 of the German population in Germany. Catholics about 1/3. But among the Protestants, there was tended to be more Lutherans than Germans. Now, the first specifically German Reformed church, because there were Dutch Reformed churches, so presumably any German-speaking person who wanted to just wanted to go to a Reformed church could have gone to the Dutch Reformed church. But the actual German Reformed church opened in 1758 on Nassau and Maiden Lane, and that also eventually moved to Forsyth near Canal and Norfolk near Stanton, so kind of was stepping its way into Kleindeutschland from its colonial roots. Okay, now here is the founder of Trinity Lutheran Church, where we're sitting today. And I think of this as probably the first Lutheran church in Kleindeutschland that was actually established by and for German immigrants. Like the others had grown out of other churches, earlier churches. Click again. Yeah, this is just some facts about him. He's born in 1808. He was the private secretary to the leader of the Saxon Lutheran emigration to Perry County, Missouri. Why there was a group of, on the ship he came over, there were about 55 people, but I think the entire group was like 200 or 300. And they were people who wanted to preserve the true Augsburg Confession of the Lutheran Church. Because in Germany at the time, it had become, the map of Germany became much more simplified after Napoleon. And a lot of these states were now larger and autonomous countries, and they were sort of the overseers of the Protestant church, but some of them didn't want to be the overseer of two Protestant churches, the Lutheran and the Reformed. So they tried to convince people to, let's just have a one Protestant denomination as the state church. They would call it evangelisch or evangelical, which to Germans just means Protestant, whereas to us it means a certain form of Protestantism. But that's why this group of Lutheran theologians and just lay people also came to this country to establish what they thought was the true Lutheran religion in Missouri. And Theodore Julius Fromm was one of the people who came with them. And the Martin Stefan was basically the leader of the group, at least at first. Look again. Yeah, I don't know why those little things, but anyway. So he was in Missouri for quite a while. He helped establish Concordia College out there. Then he was called to be the pastor here. As we heard before, this congregation started sort of informally at about 1839, and then by 1843, it was established as a full-blown congregation, and Theodor Julius Rome was the pastor. Quick again. Okay. And this is the church that we've seen a better picture of it. But yeah, it's an interesting old church. It was built as a dry dock Methodist parish. Just a little chronology, 1839, 1843. The church was not here. It was at Columbia Street, south of Houston. By 1850 is the time when it came up to 9th Street, but it still wasn't on the corner here until 1863 when they purchased that building. And then here we are today. And Pastor Brome, after his tenure here, he went back to Missouri and worked in other Lutheran churches and such, but he was really an important force in establishing a really significant Lutheran church right here in the heart of Kleindeutschland. Because before that, there were kind of churches around the edges, but his establishment of Trinity here is very important. And here's another Lutheran pastor. He was born in a town named Knopf near Kiel. Went to the University of Rendsburg. Okay. So he didn't come to America till 1847. He was an assistant. He started out as an assistant at St. Matthew's, which you may or may not recall was one of those churches that came out of Trinity and has a long, long history. So he was an assistant there, but St. Matthew's wanted to build like an annex as a mission to the new German immigrants. And that's when they built what became St. Mark's Lutheran Church. And he was the first pastor of St. Mark. So it wasn't just the Catholics who liked to fight against one another or whatever, but sometimes there were difficulties in the Protestant congregations too. So he had one more. Yeah, that's good. I just wanted to get the dates right. So he had been the pastor at St. Mark's until 1858, and then he got, fed up. So he went and started a new congregation in the village, St. John's on Christopher Street. And that building, they purchased the building, which is actually, I think, one of the oldest church buildings in New York City. And I don't remember the original congregation, but it was built in the 1820s. The church on Christopher Street, St. John's. Gives us a shot of the exterior and the interior. That's okay. But I talk about Germans like to have picnic outings. Some of you may know where this is leading. But St. Mark's, unfortunately, has this connection to one of their picnic outings in 1904. This was, I think, their 17th annual outing. somebody gave me a copy of the journal from the actual outing for that day. That's the cover of the journal. This is the second page where it says, you know, we're going to Locust Grove on Long Island on the commodious steamer General Slocum. And, you know, it's full of all the prayers and songs and the musical. There's going to be a concert. Okay, look again. And so that's what the Slocum looked like before. Unfortunately, that's what it looked like after. It was, as most of you know, a horrible disaster. Over 1,000 people, mostly women and children, were killed. Just an unbelievable tragedy. It shook the neighborhood, pretty much destroyed the congregation, even though they did manage to survive for a while, and then they moved up to Yorkville. And right over there across the street is a little memorial to the people who died on the General Slocum. Sometimes it's hard to find, but it's over in the park there, up near the northern middle of the park. A very touching little one. So just to wrap things up, look again. You know, so there was a thriving German community here, and people say, well, why, you know, what happened to it? So just very quickly, you can click one more. Great. Okay. So this is how I look at the, you know, what caused the dissolution of Kleindeutschland, and I think are the most important order of priority. Well, one thing that happened was the German-American community started doing better. Because after the 1880s, there were fewer and fewer German immigrants coming over. So people didn't want to live in the old neighborhood anymore. So, forward. Go ahead. One more. That's great. Okay. So, also at the same time, I mean, the two are probably linked, but New York City was expanding more and more northward. So even whatever Germans were coming in had newer tenements to live in uptown. And other immigrant groups came into the Lower East Side, especially Italian and Eastern Europeans came in. My Hungarian grandparents lived on 3rd Street, the same block as Most Holy Redeemer for a while. So the neighborhood is now catering to the newer immigrants. The older German immigrants were moving uptown. The Slocum disaster certainly was a landmark tragedy, I call it. It certainly destroyed, not completely, but really decimated the St. Mark's congregation, which was really the other, outside of Trinity, the other Lutheran congregation that was really in more or less the heart of Kleindeutschland. So I think it was a contributor. I wouldn't say it was like quite the final nail in the coffin or whatever. And then the last thing that people sometimes don't think about is that we entered the war against Germany in 1915, and all of a sudden German culture and language were very much suppressed in this country. I mean, in certain states you weren't allowed to teach German anymore, and even my great-grandmother changed her name from Haberstraw to Haberstraw. I thought she could have done better than that. But she thought that sounded English. So, so eventually things changed, but I don't know how much time we have for questions. Should I take? Okay. Does anybody have any?
Yeah, could you give us a little bit of context about German Catholics and German Lutherans? You know, what, were they together, apart, how in Germany and
In
here?
Germany,
And here,
okay. It's complicated. However, in Germany, I'll start there quickly. In Germany, the way the religions developed and the fact that after the 1600s, the ruler of the principality would tell the people what religion they were.
Yes.
So they'll tell you you're Catholic, you're Lutheran, you're Reformed. That's all that was allowed, technically. So you will see now, to this day, you have a village here and a village here. This one is all Catholic and this one is all Protestant because that's the way it was in the 16 and 1700s. And in modern times, people move in and out, and so, they're not 100% Catholic, but in the late 1700s, it probably was 100% Catholic and 100% Lutheran, or even 100% Reformed. So that they didn't mix that much, and when the Great Migration or immigration was going on, they probably still weren't mixing that much socially, but they did live in the same neighborhood and they worked, they probably went to the same saloons, they worked together and stuff like that. So I don't know that there's a lot of
so the
animosity.
center would have been the church of the,
Mhm.
when you say they don't mix that much, then the center of the community,
Yeah,
even
but that's for
here
the
would
part
have
of the
been church.
population that was religious.
Okay,
Sometimes Germans were divided up in this, especially in this country, into church Germans and club Germans. They all wanted to socialize and have their groups, but some would do that through their church, whether it was Lutheran or Catholic or Reformed or something else. And others would pretty much ignore church, and they had the Turnverein and this association and their singing groups and their musical groups, and they would socialize that way. So you probably saw more interaction among the club Germans between different religions than the church Germans, which I never got the sense there was strong animosity, but I think even now, still in Germany, if you are actually a practicing Catholic or practicing Protestant, you kind of still think, oh, it's Catholic. So that's just the feeling I get. Yeah.
You had one there, a whole page. Can you just say some German names? It seems to be recognizable to you. Could you list some German names?
Well,
Besides Schmidt? If
Besides
I would
Schmidt?
say Mahoney.
I'd like to offer Weber.
I don't
Weber,
know.
oh yeah, well, I mean,
Muller, Bauer, all of the
I have a
Metzger,
whole talk
all
on
of
German. So I don't even know what to be
multi-professions.
but I mean, I recognize them because, I've been speaking German for quite a while, and I do genealogical research, so I see the names. They have certain word, letter combinations that make me know it's not really a German name. It was either changed or it came from somewhere else. But, there are certain, if you know the names of different occupations, then you know what Schmidt and Müller and a lot of other ones are, or you can see, oh, that's the name of the town with an ER stuck on it. So like, somebody from that town. So, and they're, sometimes you have really weird German names, like, what is my favorite one?
Bergman?
It's like a sentence, like gets up too early. But, yeah, so if you know the language, then you know what they sound like, you know what at least parts of them mean. So that's the only way I identify them. But yeah, there are lots of them. Becker, the most common ones are the ones that are occupations, like Becker and Muller and Schmidt and Bauer, Maya. Maya with 6 different ways of spelling it. Still Maya, pronounced exactly the same. But I think that's the best I can do. Yeah.
I'd like to thank you for the lovely talk. I'm Yorkville Kleindeutschland historian.
Oh.
I pick up where you left off.
Yeah.
And I just.
I did. What's your name? I'm sure I know.
Kathy Jolowitz.
Of course.
Yeah, and I built a large, I do exhibit lectures. And I built a large exhibit of about 36 panels of artifacts from the 60s through the 60s.
I know you've been doing that longer than I have.
Yeah. I do them for free, and I have a big section on the Slocum disaster and the churches and how they formed also. And anybody who would like me to do one, I do them for free. People do them for fundraisers. So if you like, I also have a website, so.
Right. Oh, I'm glad you were here, and I'm glad you mentioned that.
I made it.
That's great.
You know, a lot of Germans also moved to the Bronx at some point with the Brewers, because I know at Woodlawn Cemetery, they have a whole section of the German Brewers, and now I went on a walking tour of Melrose, and they put down a lot of German.
My family moved from Kleindeutschland to the pre-Yorkville, and then to the Melrose neighborhood. So I'm very aware of it. And my great-grandfather, who was the banker, most of his banking was with the Brewers, handling their accounts. So, yeah, there was a really tight-knit, not gigantic, but a tight-knit German community in Melrose, or Morrisania, whatever you want to call it. Yep. And they had a German Catholic church there, and a couple of very important Lutheran churches also.
I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. That's okay.
Okay, yeah, whatever works for you guys. Okay.
On a personal note, I'd say if it wasn't that my father's older sister was sick on a certain glorious summer day in 1904, I might not be here.
Right. Yeah, that's, you know, I've heard a couple of people say, supposedly my, so-and-so grandparent or something was planning on going, but they couldn't go, whatever. And one reason why it was mostly women and children on the Slocum was, of course, it was a weekday. All the men were working, so it was the worst of all possible scenarios, I guess.
I met a German-speaking ghost 40 years ago in 1985 in Hampton Fish's apartment. She spoke to me. I was house sitting because he was in Cuba, and his father was in Congress asking for more sanctions on Cuba. And are there any books about the metaphysics of what happened after because it became much more of a German-Jewish community here after the war, after the Slocum was done. And did it really transform the community to more of a Jewish community, and did the Germans really move up to Yorkville more and more?
Well, I think they did. That's why I put this list of reasons. The General Slocum might have contributed to it, but there was already, even before that, by the 1890s and very early 1900s, the Eastern European and Italian immigrants were already coming over into this area in large numbers.
With the socioeconomic advancement, were people just having a better lifestyle and just moving to
that was
just social economic mobility?
Yeah, the first American-born generation did better, and then the next one did better than that, and they didn't want to stay down in the tenements here at that point. Anybody?
There was German in Brooklyn, also have German.
Absolutely. That's where Father Refiner built Holy Trinity in Williamsburg, my impression is, just looking at censuses and things like that, that probably a higher density of German speakers in that one part of Williamsburg there than even in Kleindeutschland. It seems to be a bit less mixed even than here. I think the numbers here overall were somewhat larger, but that was a very strong German neighborhood in Williamsburg.
Well, I think some of you might be interested in wine and cheese.
I